Okay, well, there are just a few of us here tonight, so I think everyone's going to have a chance to ask questions or multiple questions. Why don't you start, Alex?
Yeah, I have a few questions, but I'll start first. One, simple. I didn't quite get it. What is fictional and what is non-fictional narrative? What is the difference between?
Well,
can you please explain it?
Well, just on the surface, nonfiction is historiography. In other words, the histories that you read about real history, right? And those are supposed to be non-fictional, right? Although any of these theorists that we've looked at, they'll actually tell you that's not true at all, that there's a fictional strain in even non-fiction history. And then non-fictional is just historical novels. The novels I looked at were The Confessions of Nat Turner, a great work by William Styron, In Cold Blood, which Capote called a non-fiction novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, and then I didn't mention this one. It's The Killer Angels, a fictional history of the Battle of Gettysburg. So those are the two histories, fiction and non-fiction. Okay. But I definitely blur the lines between them, which really infuriates a lot of historians. They do not like that idea. They do not like being called fictionalists, right? But they're kind of, I blur the lines.
Thank you.
In a way, is it kind of like where we all have this saying, the winners write the history?
It's
kind of point. that kind of thing.
I go into that, true, right.
Can you maybe can you give us some specific historical examples where a deeper look into why or how maybe that history was created, how giving a deeper look into that might give us an insight into ourselves, or the ways our ethics are formed, or the way our culture is formed, or, I mean, that's not a very good question, but...
Yeah, I don't quite follow. I see your open points.
My original question was, can you give us some specific historical examples where a deeper look into history can give us insight into ourselves, in the ways our ethics are formed?
Right.
But I guess I was trying to expand.
Well, I think that we've all kind of been trained, really, in a lot of ways, by the pragmatic historians. They tend to demand that we look at nothing but the sequence and do not think about counterfactual things and aesthetic details and fictionalization in history. And I think we're all kind of trained from an early age that way. And so if we, I was reading The Fatal Shore by Robert Hughes, the history of Australia, how it started as a prison, and as I was reading that, I really thought that I saw a lot of this in there, and I'm hoping to maybe do that study someday. By reading it into it, by seeing, again, aesthetic factors and that sort of lively energy that they bring in, but linking that to the morality, we're going to learn more about. We're going to understand deeper, what that history is to us, right? Just the simple idea that don't just read it as sequence. Don't just read it as a dry sequence of events. You must look into it deeper than that. You must look into sensibilities, aesthetics, and morality in order to really know what went on.
When historians write history, they usually write about what happened, but sometimes they also write about could have happened. So I'm interested in some examples of this kind of historiographies about some big events, big historical events.
Right. The big events and those examples, it could be virtually anything, right? A lot of people have asked, what if Kennedy hadn't been killed, right? All of the things that he had promised, how would they have come out? And people. A lot of historical writers say just by answering those questions, again, counterfactually, it can help you understand the factual, what did happen. And so you can kind of imagine that. We might ask, what if Kennedy hadn't been killed, right? What would have happened in Vietnam? And what would have happened, I imagine, in the space race and things like that, right? And again, I guess you're going to get, maybe a dozen different answers from a dozen different people. So that could really be any event, right? What if one particular battle had been won or lost in World War II, and on and on. Now, in some ways more interesting, and I don't really have examples because they tend to be very small, is when you're reading a history, read closely, and you will actually spot, the historian will do this in very small, subtle ways, right? I was reading a history about John Adams, David McCulloch, and I noticed that at just one small point, I can't remember exactly how it went, but he wrote how Adams had traveled to Europe in a boat and that had all this rough weather. And David McCulloch, who is a major historian, two Pulitzer Prizes, he wrote, it was like, we can only wonder, you put it like that, what the captain of this boat was thinking when he berthed it in France when John Adams arrived. And just that very subtle point, we can only wonder. He asks you to wonder, right? And historians will do that. They'll ask you to think, wonder about what might have happened. Wonder about what they were thinking. Most historians won't put words into his mouth then, right? Because there's no evidence. But they'll ask you. That's a very small, subtle way that it's done, as opposed to books that might have been written, what if Kennedy had not been shot? You could write a whole book on that. You could have a lot of fun with it. That's sort of a much bigger approach, right? But I've seen it. I've seen whole essays written on what ifs, including things like Kennedy and any historical event.
We were aware of a book, I forget the name of the author, he's an American author, and we wrote kind of the working man's history of Western history since the beginning of industrialization. John somebody, and he wrote, it was kind of it was also fictional, it was just a different, completely like an interpretation based on class distinction. I forget his name.
You remember the name of the book?
John, I'm not sure.
Working Man's History of
Working Man's History.
The world, or the Western world.
Sounds familiar. There was an English author that wrote something very similar, but I'm not sure about the American.
Do we have other questions? Question?
You said that history as it happens. So the history happens today. Would it be easier to be studied? Yeah.
How do you mean?
I mean, history happened today.
Right.
Yeah. Would it be easier to be studied?
Easier?
Yeah.
Well, that's a good point that I mentioned on a kind of a different kind of conception. And that is, I do think that history is a lot easier to tell anymore. We've got so much more media going on in the world, kind of keeping track of events and all of the citizen journalists and bloggers and everything. History, history is not so invisible anymore. In the past, they would, since history was not happening, people said, it's absent, the absent past, right? And that was really a real challenge to the history writer. How do you tell what was when it's not anymore? And then you're even kind of caught on the horns of a dilemma there by telling what's not. You're sort of doing something that you shouldn't be doing, right? But these days, it's true. I think that more and more, with the records that are being kept by governments and things like that, that not much history is lost anymore. I think in the future, we're going to find ourselves like inundated with history. And that I think it's going to change the way we sort of understand ourselves. That nothing's going to be a mystery anymore. Nothing's going to be invisible. Nothing will be lost to the past anymore. Nothing's lost to the sands of time anymore. And I do think that, that losing to the sands of time was really an important part of our consciousness for centuries. And that's not going to be true anymore. And I do wonder where that's going to lead us. I'm not sure.
In terms of our ability to understand, we talk about, because of everything that's available to us today in terms of information, media.
Right.
And you mentioned that at some point that nothing is going to be lost anymore.
Right.
Do you think that has anything to do with our ability or our level, our capability to understand? You think we're kind of at the cusp of that?
We're what?
We're kind of at the cusp of that. Like in terms of back when things were all brand new and things were wide open, and now we're maybe our ability to understand and to define what we actually see
Right.
around us is becoming less and less.
Well, on the one level, we have to ask, how are we going to interpret all of this data that's out there? Right? Everything is remembered on the page and in records and what have you, but how will we interpret it, right? In the past, you didn't have nearly that luxury. The past was absent, and often there were no records. I mean, historians have written entire histories just based on a few coins that were found that were like 2,000 years old. Entire histories of like Roman civilizations just based on pieces of cloth and coins. And you know, actually that ties to an idea that I've had that in terms of the narrative, every piece of evidence is narrative. Every piece of historical evidence is narrative. And every piece of evidence is like a ray of light. As a ray of light travels across the universe, it sees everything around it. Everything is reflected in it, and it carries that forward. So our goal is, when we get that tiny ray of light, it's all in there. All the data is in there. The entire narrative is in there. But we're challenged because even the best of us will probably only get a little bit of it at best. But actually it's all in there, right? And that's true. That's why that coin, the entire narrative is in there of the Roman civilization. Interpreting it out, that's the hard part, right? And I wonder, with all, with this mass of information that we're going to have in the future, how will we interpret it, right? Will we get that right? Or will we somehow blow it and just be lost in all that and not, will it just be too much for us? Right? And I'm not sure, right? What do you think? Do you think we're gonna get it better? I mean, in the past, we've had a lot of mistold histories in the past, and a lot of mistakes made. But now we're not going to have that excuse anymore.
I was going to quick response. I don't think we're going to get it better.
Probably not. Right? Even though it's all there,
I
right?
think even our technology, the tools we're using to understand. I think we're kind of lost in the tools.
Right.
Lori, you have another question?
I have a question about, you said ethics will use their experience, the history experience, to distinguish what is good, what is bad. But nowadays we have a problem about abortion. And how does ethics people think about this? Like, this is good or bad, is normal? How do they think is a moral thing or immoral thing?
Mm-hmm. Just abortion?
Yeah, this is just an example.
Right.
Hard to distinguish bad and good.
Well, yeah, true. But you got two sides of the abortion issue. Some are pro and some are con, right? Some support the idea and some don't. And both have moral arguments. And what can you say? Those are like the difficult moral arguments where both sides can be fairly convincing, right? And that's when it gets difficult. What can you say? Any war that's started can have like voices for and against it, and it can be pretty difficult to concretely show which side is more credible or more acceptable. That's about all I can say with that. I mean, we could ask everyone in this room what they say about abortion, and we would get a couple of different answers. And I'm not sure what to say. Again, both arguments can be credible. I mean, I've felt that about abortion. The people who are against it, I think their arguments are very credible, right? That human life is sacred and that you cannot eliminate any human life at all in terms of abortion. Let's just say that, not other ways that life is eliminated. I think it's a credible argument. But those that are more pragmatic and say, that the life of the woman has to be taken into account, and what her life would be like with the baby, that has to be taken into account. She has the freedom to make that decision, right? They're both credible arguments. I don't know what to say. War is another good example, right? I mean, I've even, Afghanistan, I've seen credible arguments for and against it. Iraq. and it makes it complicated then, right? I think then we really get into, like, you know, really the study of pragmatic ethics then, and how decisions are made by people.
I have a question. It's obvious that history influences the narrative, the fictional narrative, right?
Naturally. That's what fictional history is, right?
I mean, but is it possible that the fictional narrative can influence the history?
Absolutely.
The history that has already been done. How is it possible?
How do you mean? Any historian that sits down and starts writing, he's going to bring in an aesthetic toolkit. And those aesthetics are identical to those used in fictional histories, right? In that respect, he is fictionalizing. He does bring in an aesthetic tool bag that includes things like metaphor and synecdoche and irony and things like that. And in that sense, he's actually fictionalizing up to a point. Of course, most historians would deny it, and they credibly so, because they could say, but just again, by the same token, anytime a historian asks, you know, well, I don't know the entire story here, right? All I've got is fragments of evidence, but I'm going to attempt to tell the history of this people or this nation. Then, as I said, just with coins, whole books have been written, right? And you got to wonder, how's that done? But they do it. Because they can kind of conjecture up out of that. So in effect, they are fictionalizing.
This question about historians in the past. I mean, at some point, like way back when historians were state-owned, basically.
State-owned?
State-owned.
In some sense, true, right.
Nations and agendas, and they have historians to go find out the truth or go to maybe verify the story that they want.
True.
To be told. Does that still exist today, do you think? Do you think it does have, I mean, there's historical institutions, are they attached to governments or attached to, are you aware of any of?
Isn't that what happened in the USSR? That's been shown. Yeah, USSR historians were, you know, they were given, you know, guidance and exact structures by the government. So that's not too long ago. But you'd expect that in an authoritarian government. I'm not sure to what extent that's happening, say, in China, although I think I've heard that in some senses it does happen there. You know, the government does sort of control the history that's conveyed, right? It's put in a real positive light all the time and that kind of thing. What would be interesting is in free countries, to what extent does it happen?
Maybe historians need funding.
Right.
Do the research, like any practice.
And that does happen, right.
And often the money does not come from
government sources. Right.
Someone who has an idea about what they want.
And again, that bias enters into it. Anybody that funds a historian, inevitably they're going to have some bias, right, that they want. Very few people would be totally unbiased in the history they want told, right? And, you know, you might ask yourself also, you know, how important is it for a country, a nation, a people to, you know, tell the history the way they want to, right? To frame it in a way that makes them, you know, feel better, makes them feel more confident, right? And how much is that allowable, right? I think it's fairly allowable, that's true. As I said with McPherson, I do detect some sort of pro-American feelings in his writing, right? He's supposed to be a totally objective historian, but I can definitely sense it. And I think you'd find that just, you know, national feeling is just real strong that way, right? And even any of us probably do it, you know? I might be fairly pro-American, right, in the way I tell what I know about America, right? And maybe we're all that way a little bit.
Just in terms of your understanding, your cultural understanding.
Yeah.
You're finding you can't go beyond what you know culturally. What you apply. But yeah, I mean, do you think that, I mean, history is, as you mentioned many times, that it's story. I mean, there's fictional and non-story.
Right.
But non-fictional is just the science of documenting.
Right. A lot of it is.
But, I mean, at some point that that evidence has to be put into context,
Right.
So that's when the story starts
Right.
to get told.
The story is told, right.
And so there's always an agenda in the same
Right,
guy,
right.
there always has to be some.
True. Nobody wants a dull story, right? If it's going to be a story, and that's when historians would definitely say they're great storytellers, and the works show that, then you don't want a dull story. So they are going to have that agenda just to jazz it up a little, right? And as I was saying also, I just think any nation and people tend to, most of them, of course, there's always, you know, the rebels that are not supportive of their home country or their home nation, but most are. Most, you know, it is natural we're drawn that way. But we have to be careful. Right?
Can I ask another question?
Yeah, I want to say one more thing. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, I was interested in knowing what you think about when the ethics of two different histories will confront each other.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, two different histories written by different historians.
Right.
Actually, written about the same
Right.
thing.
Right.
Like, for example, okay, Japan and China, Second
Right.
World War, they
Yeah.
have two different ethics
True.
in the history, right?
Right. Right.
These kind of things, you know. Like in Europe, we have like everyone has its own history, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
And the Kosovo thing, you have
Yeah, right. True.
one side, the other side. So
And,
what do we do?
you know,
with the
like,
ethics
you know, the
divided?
history books for students that are written, right? That's an issue in Japan. It's an issue in Taiwan, right?
Yes. So what's your opinion about this? With these two ethics?
I think we're right back to where we were. That you know, we all have you know, the skills and the responsibility to make decisions, and we're going to look at the work, right? And we're going to judge the credibility of the work, right? That's why very few Holocaust deniers get much acceptance or credibility at all, right? Very few. But there's going to be some finer lines than that, right? Now, you know, we might think that, you know, that the massacre in Nanjing was, you know, just concretely, you know, a wrong action and an immoral action. But apparently that's not what they think in Japan. A lot of the people there, right? Apparently they justify it in different ways. And so to them it's not so concrete. It's
There is no actually way to solve these problems. We'll leave
Probably not.
to the winners.
Right.
Right?
Well, the winners will definitely get their way a lot, true. But if the different stories are being told, you're always going to have, you know, some classes of people and groups of people that are going to be out there and they're going to be noticing and they're going to be speaking, right? But you're right, the winners, they do have that way of kind of dominating the conversation, which, you know, it's kind of a sad thing, right? Right. But it's a good point. Because it's interesting because you're going to find, just as I was saying, there's going to be arguable points, right? You know, even Germans these days, you know, they've had a big kind of cultural wrenching, examining, you know, World War II and Hitler and everything, and you know, and I think you're going to find that, you know, this battle or this particular action, you know, how unjust was it? How immoral was it, right? In the context of war, it makes it even harder, right? Because people are going to kill each other, and so then that just makes it very hard. Was what we did in this, you know, this place or in this battle right or wrong? I guess you're going to get. You know, I'm reminded of that book that came out. It's not really a history book, but it's sort of historical in a way. The Bell Jar, remember that one? The Bell Jar, published in the United States. And these two scholars wrote a very, very well-researched book that came up with a fairly credible argument that showed that blacks were actually genetically less able than whites. And they had all of the data, they had all of the research and data that supported what they said. And many people said their research was fairly sound, right? It was hard to deconstruct the research, right? And I don't know, the book's been attacked and it's pretty much been dismissed. And I don't know the whole story of that story. But that was just one point where they wrote a book, and apparently they went into it feeling that they were just and credible in what they were writing. They weren't just Holocaust deniers. It wasn't that crazy. They thought they were writing a very good research piece that showed what they were trying to say. And then that's just one example. A lot of people accepted it too, and I think a lot of people still do.
I think there is a flip side to that. I mean, you look at the Holocaust, and because of the atrocity that happened, the storytellers who have maybe the Jewish bias have been allowed to tell the story again and again and again and again, whereas on the German side...
True, right. They're boxed out. Right?
Maybe they don't want to. The Germans don't want to speak as loud as the Jewish side does.
Right.
But still, there's been sort of and also from an audience point of view, and people will go to movies still about that story, and they'll listen to the one side. There's millions of people dying. Of course, it touches on something that we like to have touching on. The idea of overcoming and triumph, and it doesn't take away from. I think sometimes historians respond to that as, hey, wait a minute, this is only one half of the story, even though it is real and it's a horrible thing that happened.
Right.
At some point, we have to take the whole picture.
Right. True. Right.
So there's kind of a dualism to the whole ethics of what should be told and what should not be told, and how long should it be told.
Yeah.
It affects the way, the more we hear about it, the deeper, it affects us as a people, as nations, and
Right. Okay.
Okay, well, just the last thing I wanted to say, and I'll let you respond to this, but we're out of time. Listening to your speech tonight reminded me of a Picasso painting that I was looking at today. I was really trying to figure out what Picasso's feelings or motivations were, or why did he do this, and I noticed that he had maybe started to do one painting and then painted over that painting.
Oh yeah, I think I've seen that. Right.
Well, he probably did that a number of times. A lot of painters do that a number of times. But it seems that you're saying that we should look at history not just for its brush strokes, shading, or colors, but also for the whys and feelings behind the painting of history itself. Is that what you're saying?
That seems like a good point, right? Seems like a good point. But if you're asking the feelings and the whys, then you're asking about the painter then, right? And then our painters, I guess, are historical writers. I guess that's who it is. Although I'd like to take it a lot farther than that. I tend to think that even in my work and in my readings, I've tended to focus a little bit too much on great historians and great historical writers, right, who wrote great fictional histories. And they do I think they really do shape the dialogue, right? That they have a great outsized influence. But I really do wonder, what in terms of what we were talking about, the bloggers and the citizen journalists and all of their histories that they're telling. And then I also wonder just about, again, back to this idea of our narrative history that's in our minds. I really want to go into a much more real world level, examining real people, right? Not just the great historical writers, but just people like us. And I'm really wondering, how do we keep our history, right? Does it just all disappear? Are we all just sort of like floating along without keeping our own history? And I think a lot of people probably do that, right? But I'm interested to find out how you and how we maintain our history, right? And that's just an area that I hope to go into in the future.
Okay.
I think it'll be very interesting, right? Okay.
Okay, thanks, David.